Welcome to part 3 of our series on volunteer recruitment, selection, and screening. In this section, we'll discuss the importance of screening volunteers and provide some simple guidelines to get you started. So, what is volunteer screening and why is it important? Volunteer screening is the process of evaluating volunteers to determine their appropriateness for service with an organization and to limit that organization's exposure to any dangers related to the characteristics of the volunteer. Simply put, you want to ensure that volunteers are a good and safe match for the organization and for the people it serves. By screening volunteers, you'll be able to confirm that volunteers are appropriate and capable of doing the job. Identify any volunteers who may be dangerous in some way to clients, staff, or the image of the organization. You'll also be able to confirm that volunteers possess any qualifications they claim that are related to the job. Together, these steps allow you to limit the organization's exposure to risk and improve your effectiveness. I do want to take a moment to mention interviewing. Interviewing practices are discussed in part 2 of our series. However, that element of the selection process is actually the first step in an ideal screening strategy. Using the interview methods mentioned in the previous section, you'll gain a better understanding of the unique assets and risks that accompany prospective volunteers. That's all I'll mention about interviews in this section. Just remember, the interview is important and it lays the foundation for a quality approach to screening volunteers. Now on to reference checks. Like interviews, reference checks are often associated with traditional job applications, but they're sometimes ignored when arranging volunteers. Although volunteers may provide references who they assume will provide only positive information, this may not be the case. The references may still provide telling and essential information. When checking references, it's important that you ask how the reference knows the applicant and for how long. How does the applicant deal with challenges on the job? What strengths does the applicant bring to their work? And does the reference have any reservations or concern about the applicant serving with the organization or in a particular capacity? It's also important and appropriate to ask for questions that may be specific to the type of work. For example, if the volunteer will work with children, you could ask how well they interact with children, or if the reference believes the applicant is suited to working with children. Another similarity to interviewing is that there are certain questions you shouldn't ask during a reference check. For example, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, race, and the rest of the characteristics listed on the screen are not appropriate to ask during a reference check. Background checks are another important part of the screening process. Every organization is different, and you may have unique needs which determine how thoroughly you need to screen volunteers. There are, however, some simple characteristics of a volunteer position that indicate when a thorough screening should include a background check. For example, it's appropriate and advisable to conduct background checks from volunteers who will be doing any of the following: supervising children or other at-risk individuals, handling money, working with confidential information such as donor records, working with overnight groups, or driving. If a background check is appropriate, there are many organizations which can be hired to conduct various levels of investigation. Many options are available, and there are investigative options designed and priced specifically for organizations with volunteer programs. A notable example of these services is offered by LexisNexis Risk Solutions. You can learn more about that specific option by visiting volunteer.lexisnexis.com. Although the background check provider I just mentioned specializes in volunteer background checks, any authorized agency will be able to offer adequate screening. Many volunteer tasks are designed for one-time walk-in volunteers, which makes it impractical to conduct background checks, interviews, or reference checks. In these cases, liability and risk can be limited by consistent supervision, clear instruction, and by providing proper resources for the volunteers. You should always provide adequate equipment, supervision by a qualified paid or volunteer staffer with the appropriate experience and knowledge, and providing specific instructions and tasks that are clearly identified. The verification of credentials for certified positions is also important. It's possible that your organization may seek or be offered the services of professionals such as physicians or attorneys. Before you allow a volunteer to serve in capacities such as these, it's important that you verify their credentials. Thankfully, the state-level authorities who regulate and license these professions also provide a means of verifying their qualification and membership in their professional organization. You should always confirm with your state medical board, bar, or the equivalent agency for other professions that the volunteer is licensed to practice before allowing them to serve in that capacity for the organization. Screening is a key step to ensuring that your volunteer staff are equipped and appropriately placed in positions within the organization, but it's not a substitute for an organization's risk management strategy. A solid risk management policy should be in place in addition to having stringent volunteer screening practices. Several examples of risk management actions would be to develop specific and exhaustive policies and procedures, and to have liability waivers from clients and volunteers. You can learn more about the topic of risk management by visiting the Nonprofit Risk Management Center's website at nonprofitrisk.org. Additional information is also available in the Volunteer Management Handbook published by John Wiley & Sons. The recommendations presented in this part of our series were drawn from the reports and real-world experience of the sources listed on the screen. I encourage you to also view the previous parts of our series to learn the basics of volunteer recruitment and selection. Thanks for taking the time to watch, and we wish you the best in working with your volunteer partners.